like to give a warm welcome to Dr. Todd Gray, MD, who holds the freedom of the City of Exeter. But not only does he hold the freedom for the City of Exeter, but he's also got a 3D representation or reproduction of the key to Exeter's East Gate. I think that's quite unique, isn't it, Todd? Yes. Now, he was raised in New England, but we can't blame him for that. And he became fascinated by Devon's history following a school trip in 1973. See, young enough to still be going to school in 1973. That's impressive as well, Todd. And he completed his doctorate in 1988 at the University of Exeter. Now, Todd is thorough and methodical in his approach, studying the content of thousands, and I do mean thousands, of original documents. One of the sites that I was reading was talking about how many linear miles of documents that Todd had seen, so quite impressive. Now, you can currently see one of these many thousands of documents in the RAM Museum in the Plain Sight exhibition, which I would recommend. It's free. And one of the documents there that Todd looked at, he noted the list of slaves and their value because they belonged to a Devonian with a curiously appropriate name of Sweet in relationship to owning sugar plantations and many slaves dealing with sugar. Now, much is known about the slave trade linked to London, Liverpool and Bristol, but less so about Devon. So through his research, Todd has endeavoured to find out links with our maritime county. Not easy when there was very little printed research, but Todd was up to the challenge, as you will see from this morning's presentation. And after the presentation, he's got a number of his superb books for sale. I haven't got any shares in these books, but it's quite a good job to be able to do that, because when you've gone through so many documents, what's really difficult is condensing it and making sense of it. So thank you, Todd.
This is very hard history. It's unforgiving. It's brutal. And I don't think anyone in this room is unaware of the sheer inhumanity. I should say at the start, I'll preempt what I'm going to say. I've been called brave that they are either not covering this topic or they've been told not to cover this topic. Because of the problems of the reaction uniquely for this topic. There's nothing else in history that brings out the passions on this and the problems that can envelop a university. This is not being done. So people who would normally have thrown in something on 18th century Devon and mentioned Black history, it's gone. What people are afraid of is being cancelled. And I've had one attempt by a group of people who are not Devon. They've never done Devon research. I can't see that they've read a Devon history book, but they know more about Devon history than I do. So they wrote to the university demanding that I be expunged from the university. Oh. And the university treated an anonymous email seriously. The history department refused to have anything to do with it and said they were wrong in everything that they said. But it's the danger at the moment of a form of censorship we haven't seen in this country in 200 years. So when I say it's unforgiving and brutal, it is in different ways than one would expect. Now, I think it's helpful, even this is problematic to mention, that you talk about Devon slave colonies, not just in isolation itself, but remember other genocides in our history, particularly the mid-20th century totalitarian regimes in Germany and in Russia, well, the Soviet Union, which is making a return in our last few months. The sudden loss of rights in Ukraine and the extermination of people who are of the right type. But today, what we're going to look at is a form of enslavement which has a longer history, a longer legacy, including here in Devon. Now, I'm using notes so that in case somebody does complain and writes to the Vice Chancellor or writes to the Western Morning News, I at least have a text I can point to. It's gotten that serious. But I will not be intimidated and I will not be bullied. But we are talking about an extraordinary period in our history where for hundreds of years, millions of people were enslaved, initially because they weren't Christians, and then because they were of a different color than we are. And the treatment that they were given, not just in slavery, is, as I say, brutal. But words in this topic can easily cause upset. Recently, we saw how Whoopi Goldberg, with the best of intentions, got it very wrong. She said that the Holocaust wasn't about race, not understanding the Jewish people do not see themselves just as white, but as a separate race in themselves. But from her viewpoint, all white people are the same. And this is the difficulty in this topic. It brings out things in society, as we know, is changing. How many of us feel comfortable talking about transsexual, the transsexual process? It's enveloping underneath our very nose and eyes. It's happening now. What we say this week will be different from 5 years or 10 years time. Society's altering, and it's easy to get it wrong. The language, black, colored, Negro, all words which evolved from at one time being considered progressive are now inappropriate. Nearly 30 years ago, many historians agreed that the word slave was outdated, and they turned to using the enslaved. Now, slave is making a comeback. The research in this lecture can take many by surprise, and sometimes with anger. You may have seen, if you're a reader of the Western Morning News, a public letter calling on me to apologize because I had used the word Devon as a slave name. And we had been unaware until the work I did that Devon is a slave name. We didn't appreciate that here. All over the West Indies in America, Devon is a first name. It goes back to the 1700s and the 1800s, when, as a slave owner, you gave names to your slaves with days of the week, months of the year, maybe names of flowers, and you gave them topographical names. Exmouth, Totnes, Dartmouth, or Yorkshire, Suffolk, and Devon. Of all of these names, Devon is the only one that continued. So across the West Indies and South of America particularly, there are black people and not white people called Devon, not knowing. We never called anybody Devon in Devon. It's not a Christian name. And that's the whole point of it. You do not give enslaved people Christian names because you didn't baptize them. So these little connections are ones which make us think about the past. There's a lack of published research on Devon in regards to slavery, as in nearly every county in England. And I have been told, historians have let us down. And I've had to say, well, you do know every book, every article, everything done on Devon history is done by a volunteer. No one's paid. We rely on people, I know some in the audience, who go away and work on their own, give up their time, write up material which otherwise wouldn't be written up. We have 2 books on women in Devon. That's it. Even though women have made up the majority of the population always. Women's history is only starting taking off in the 1980s. Well, this history is taking off now. So I think you have to give historians a bit of a break if they haven't written what people want them to write. My reply always is, do it yourself. Yes. I had a woman who said, nobody's written a history of the Hungarians in Devon. And I thought, well, nobody's going to, because we just don't know about Hungarians in Devon. How many are there? When did they come? She said, well, I'm not written up in any book. I thought, look, love, until you do it, nobody's going to do it either. I mean, do we have a book on Peruvians in Devon? Or the Chinese in Devon? It has to attract somebody in order for somebody to work on it. And this isn't hidden or secret history, it's just unresearched history. Now, this has been brought home to me with 2 different views which are expressed. And all of this topic has one way or the other. And this is one of them. Just how white, just how black is Devon? And we can look at it in 3 different ways. Now, we know the first recorded black person is probably a man in Dartmouth. He's called James Black. He's from India, and that's 1484. We don't really know how he got here. We don't really know anything else about him, but he's recorded in one document. There are more, which I'm going to come back to, but the next 2 are the ones which people generally know more about. War of 1812, there were 1,000 black American sailors at Princetown Prison in the War of 1812. Now, they had their own building, they were segregated, and they had their own theater. And one of the asides we know about them is they performed Shakespeare in whiteface. It was what people did. It was a way of satirizing black people and white people. You put color on your face. Now, what's interesting, we have an account by an American prisoner who watched a man 6'2", dressed as Juliet, black, murdering, he said, the part of Juliet. Well, we know a little bit about that, but of course we know a lot more about the Second World War, when the American government insisted that when their soldiers came here, the blacks would be segregated from the whites. And in Devon, all the officials went up to Bristol and were told, this is what's going to happen. It was a condition of the war. So in Exeter, black soldiers from America were on one side of the river, white ones were on the other. And this is replicated all across Britain. And we know 83 mixed race babies were born in Devon between 42 and 45. 38 in Cornwall. It's easy to remember because 83 reverse it is. Now, the earlier period is very interesting for us. Now, this is a Dutch engraving of a black girl, and we know all of these people were of African origin, if not born in Africa, were in Plymouth. When you look through, you notice that baptisms and burials, no marriages. These are people who have come to Plymouth in circumstances we don't know. But they're recorded in the parish register. And this is where we find them. There is Negro or nigger. I'm not sure what they mean. N-I-G-O-R. The parish clerk has decided to refer to the person in that sense. So we have in Barnstable a little group. So let's see, the orange are people recorded in parish registers in what might be interpreted as small numbers in the late 1500s and the early 1600s. 7 in Barnstable, 3 in Hatherley, 1 in Exeter, 1 in Colleton, 1 in East Darlington, which is down in the South Downs, and 14 in Plymouth. Now, these are low numbers on one sense, but I suspect they're higher than other parts of the country that didn't have the trading connections we had in the late 1500s and early 1600s. The green dots are Native Americans. And we know Native Americans were also kidnapped and brought here. You had some later on in the 1700s in Exeter. But they are here in a questionable degree of freedom, whereas with some of the Africans, the blacks, I think they were free. They were taken on board, I think, privateer ships, brought into the ports, and then just given jobs, taken from the Spanish or the Portuguese. We have in 1570 a legacy to one man who's called Anthony, and the man who's dying, the head of the household, says, I give Anthony £5 and a bit more if he stays with my wife in service, which implies a degree of independence and freedom. We didn't know that either, so it's complicated, but we start to learn things. But I think until recently, the portion of Black people in Devon was lower than 0.0%. It's never been 1%, it's never been 0.1%, it's always been much lower. And that, of course, reflects Devon, rural, underpopulated, and mostly poor. There wasn't a reason to come here like there was in London or the industrialized North or the Midlands. There are exceptions where we find some good information, and that's with Dahlia Graham, who is one of the Blacks that come here early on in the 1800s. She had been kidnapped in Africa as a child, brought to Georgia in America. Her owner then retires to Exeter, frees her, keeps her as a household servant, and then in 1850, we find her in the workhouse in Exeter. If you know where Waitrose is, that's the site of the workhouse, which is kind of funny. But Dahlia Graham is happy to be there in the words of the man who interviews her. We don't hear from her directly. We hear from somebody for her. And we only have one instance, which I'm going to end with, where we actually have the words of somebody who's enslaved. Now, the reason why I'm involved in this topic is because of Maya Angelou, who you may know, the American writer and poet. When she came to Exeter in the 90s, she was brought to the university as a teaching fellow. A friend arranged it. We had a cup of coffee. Maya asked what I knew of Devon's relationship to slaving. I told her there's nothing written, but I knew of documents. So had a look at the documents, and on the next visit, next cup of coffee, she said, why don't I write it up? And I said, because I have lots else to do. But 15 years later, I followed it up with the first book. She warned me then, 30 years ago nearly, that this was a topic unlikely to make anybody happy. And the world has changed by then, but it's still what I call inconvenient history. Inconvenient in that the evidence isn't wanted by people on one side or the other far side. Only the people in the middle who I hope give a fair hearing to the evidence. Now, opinion. Oops, I'm going to ignore that one. Oh yeah, this is the 4 areas we're going to talk about. That way you'll understand slaving and emancipation. We're going to talk about the Black presence, slaving voyages themselves, plantations, emancipation in 34, and then trade. But this is where opinion counts. And the famous portrait at the Ram in Exeter, we don't know who it is, how you interpret it is up to you. Even more so with this portrait of an 18th century woman who has a black mask, so she can pretend to be a black person in an upmarket ball. Whether this is a comment on class and status and race, or if it's a bit of fun, it's what you see in it. I cannot find any comment by the artist himself. And the same thing with this. It's actually a portrait of an actor from America who's performing in a play called The Slave, which he performed in Exeter and in Plymouth. So he came here as a former slave, performing in a play about slavery, possibly to slave owners in the audience. It's how one thinks about that portrait that matters. There's no bottom line as there is with the documents. Now, I did Devon and slave trade, just documents. No politics, just the evidence. Then the last one, Devon's last slave owners, all about emancipation. And the middle one is a history of how we divide people from each other. Race is included as well as religion and money and all the rest of it. Now, the historian's role is to check facts and to apply rigor. So of all the things that people say, what I'm trying to do is get to the evidence and say, all right, you believe this, but this is what we can say from the evidence. It's not very popular. What I have to do to convince some people is point out that a historian tries to be objective. Now, I'm just finished the third volume in the series, Devon Parish Taxpayers, 1500 to 1650. I can assure you it's as interesting as it sounds. As part of that, I'm looking at church warden accounts for all of Devon, there are about 70, mostly 1500s, early 1600s, to see what role women have in the parish. It looks like before the Reformation, as Catholics, they did more in administration than they did under the Puritans, which is new information. So I have 10% at the moment. That number will go up or will go down. And as you will know, it doesn't really matter to me if it's 15% or 5% or 60%. Whatever the documents say is what you use. Whereas in this topic, people now say, I don't need evidence to know about the past. I have my feelings. But that's what you write fiction with, not what you base history on. So, and you've seen some of these before, everything is based on evidence. What you can say has to be referenced in some way. Now, this is the problem we have at the moment, where assumptions matter more. In America, most of my family are convinced that Trump had the election stolen from him. Now, there's no evidence, but that doesn't stop people from believing it. Again, I know a number of people who won't have the vaccination because there's a computer chip in it. There's no evidence of a computer chip, but that doesn't stop people from believing it. That it's all a conspiracy. And it's the same thing with this topic and how opinion matters more. And I've been told, you're hiding evidence. You're making up evidence by the same person. You may have seen this program, which was on last autumn. Charlene White, the newsreader, comes to Devon, and this is us at Buckland Abbey, where she's looking at a Totnes ancestor. And she wanted to know one thing from me off camera. Why is it that we're never told Black people owned other Black people? Her ancestor was a white slave owner and his black slave. Her children were given slaves. So they were mixed race. Now there's a very high percentage in Jamaica of people in 1834 who owned slaves who were mixed race. It makes sense, but she was shocked. And I felt sorry for her because she said, I've never heard this, and I'm trying to work out how I have a white ancestor who owned my other white ancestor, and how they then owned other human beings. She's used to thinking blacks are the victims of whites. And I said the difficulty is the history, like all of history, is so complicated that we don't want to hear the detail that gets lost in the big picture. So, I think what has happened in the last few years is this politicalization of history, this polarizing of views, and it took off here, I think, when George Floyd died. And you just could not believe a man would put his knee on another man's throat and allow him to die. It's shocking, but growing up in America, you realize it happened all the time. And the thousands of black people who've been lynched, in the 1800s and early 1900s because they were black. It's very different here, not to undermine anybody thinking about who's black and what they've suffered, but it's very different. The formation of Black Lives Matter, I think, and then this polarized views a little bit more. I think it's been destructive to society. Maybe we need it, that's another topic for non-historians. But we have views which are expressed as fact. Now, I should say, those who are socially conservative on the right don't recognize this as a valid topic. They want to celebrate the past and embrace empire's achievement. Most comments are more defensive, they're personally stated, they are not projected in a public environment in that nobody lectures about this. Whereas on the other side, we have an active group of race consultants, trainers, and cultural commentators, very competent in modern race relations, working towards equality, and they've been more vocal in projecting a history which is not based on evidence, but what they want the history to be. So we have two different views. Now, this is something people have said to me, not in the lecture, they've just said, I've read that enslaved people, slaves were happier in the colonies than when they were free in Africa. And you can find that evidence. There are books in the 1700s and 1800s which tell us that. There's an image of how happy the slaves are. But what the evidence says is that slaveholders said their slaves were happier. We have book after book written by slaveholders, desperate to keep their slaves, trying to convince the British public that in Africa they were unhappy, but in the West Indies they were grateful to be enslaved. They had full meals, they had homes, they had jobs. This is something which has been said for 30 years. Slaves were sold on the quaysides of every Devon port. And I asked the person who had given a lecture and said that, I said, what evidence do you have? Well, no evidence can be found that any slave was ever sold on any Devon quayside. But people want that to be true. People in the middle who hear one side and the other side ask me, what is true? Well, this is another one. Devon's country houses were built with the profits of slavery. This was on Spotlight. where the woman said, all the Devon's country houses were built with slave money. And I said, how do you know that? Well, Powell and all the great county houses were not built with slave money. Out of the 2,000 or so country houses we have in Devon, I found 3 that I'm pretty certain you could say were built with slave plantation money. But in order to do the rest of them, what you need to do is look at each owner, where they got their income from, where their wives had their marriage payments from, and then do an analysis. It takes years to do that, and nobody has. So how can somebody who's never done any research stand up being an expert and say that? It's because they want that history. And that's the danger, with opinion becoming fact. And it's on spotlight, so it must be true. Now, 1834, when slaves were free, Glenthorne was built with the money given to slave owners up near Linton. Nearby is another house called Coombe Park, which is now in ruins. It was only there for about 10 years before it was pulled down. That was built with slavery money. I'm pretty certain we can say Milcombe Villa on Lundy, as is the entire island of London, was built and purchased with slave money. In Oxton, just across the river, Reverend Sweet.
Shush.
That was probably 90%, 95% certain we can say that's slavery money. But for the other 1,994, we need research. Some will, but I don't think the numbers are going to be high enough to make everybody happy or low enough to make the other ones happy. And I balance between the two. Now, the difficulty underneath all of this is understanding how local history is. What we generally have are activists move from other parts of the country. They read a book on Bristol or Liverpool or London, and they assume Devon is going to be the same. It's a revelation that Cornwall doesn't have the same history as Leicester, or that Lancashire isn't very much like Suffolk. Every county is different. If you've never done history, you've never thought about it. So when I argued with them and I said, look, you do know Devonport and Totnes aren't a lot alike. And they never have been. They have different histories. When you crisscross Devon, we have Renaissance carving like this, 1500s North Devon. We have in Dartmouth in the early 1600s religious depictions in plaster, whereas in North Devon, they tend to go for animals. Different traditions in loads of different ways. Anybody interested in Devon history will know how different one place is to the other. West Devon has an art form developed out of memorial stones in the 1700s. They do pictures nobody else does. In the South House, we've got shingle on the side of the buildings, but not North Devon or Mid Devon. Some places in Devon, it's a stook. Some places it's a shook. And some places it's a stitch. Same thing, but different traditions in different places. If you're in South Devon, you may say dimity. In North Devon, it's dipsy, for twilight. Now, all of these things are little things, but you put them all together. We all know the difference between Cornwall and Devon, but in Devon, we had a little sweet bun, which in Ashburton was an Ashburton. In Chudley, it was a Chudley. In North Devon, it was called a cut round. Everybody had a different way of calling their little buns. Well, this is what makes up Devon history like everywhere else. It's the differences. And this is what I look at. My question has always been, how does Devon fit into this? But it's not very popular. So we're going to look at three different areas. We're going to look at those three different areas, but this is the way in which I am continually told to approach this topic. On one side, the view is the way in which slaves were freed was because white people made them free through abolition. The left believes it wasn't that, it was insurrection of slaves in the West Indies. And I'm told, don't talk about one or the other. Famously, one woman shouted out to me, don't talk about abolition, it lets white people off their guilt. And I thought, well, that's not what historians are here to do. We're here to give the evidence. Now, one side wants to talk about white slavery going to North Africa from Devon. The other side sticks to just talking about African enslavement in the Americas. Another area of difference, one side wants to talk about slaves sold from one side of Africa to the other, while the other just wants to talk about it crossing the Atlantic. And I will get emails and letters and phone calls telling me I talked about the wrong topic. One woman even said to me, you're not the right person to work on Devon history. And that was because I had the wrong skin color. I find that chilling. So, what's claimed? Devon was the leading county in slave voyages, or Devon had no slave voyages after John Hawkins, 1563 to 1568. They both can't be true. What does the evidence tell us? Well, there were 12,000 slaving voyages from England. 40 of them left Devon. So we had 0.3% of all slaving voyages. Unbelievably, that is too much, and that is too little. Sometimes when people in the same audience will argue with me, those figures can't be right. But they are government statistics, tabulated every year. Now, 25 are in the late 18th century, but you can see the mix. And 15 of them are French vessels leaving from Devon ports. Now, there could be Devon vessels leaving from Bristol or from another port, but that's what the statistics tell us. And you can see Plymouth is the bigger one, 23 in those years. Some people say white slavery in North Africa. This was when Muslims in North Africa took Europeans hostage back to Morocco, Algeria, Libya, Tunisia, from the late 1500s into the early 1800s. They say it's as significant as African enslavement. Others say it doesn't matter at all. There's no numbers at all. So, what we can say is just over 1 million Europeans were enslaved in North Africa. We estimate 10 to 16 million Africans were enslaved in the Americas. So the numbers are, at least for every white European, there's probably 10 to 16 black Africans. But in the Devon context, more Devonians were taken captive to North Africa than we are recorded have taken Africans to the Americas. So we have the national and we have the local. And again, it doesn't make people happy. What's claimed? Devon's slavery built the economy. Everybody was telling me from one side, we all know Devon's economy was based just on slavery. What does the evidence tell us? Well, it was dominated by cloth. Cloth is what built Devon's economy. That's it there, the little sample of cloth I discovered a few years ago. Well, we've got statistics. You can't see them, but the numbers in red are the biggest export. It goes from Germany to Holland to Italy in the late 1700s. It's only on the continent that we have ships recorded as sending cloth. Nowhere else. Now, it is said now, well, of course, we all know that most of the cloth went to Africa. It has to be less than 0.00%. Hoskins says it's an insignificant fraction. The theory now, as soon as you do something, people say, but. Theory is the cloth was being taken to London and then shipped from London to Africa. But the London customs accounts don't show a great deal of Devon cloth going to Africa. A very small amount. I don't think woolen Devon cloth was popular in Africa. They preferred Manchester cotton. It was more versatile, let alone being easier to wear. Now, this is one. The trade in slave colonies goods, tobacco, sugar, cotton, coffee, dyes, there's tar, there's rice, lots of things that slaves are producing. Are we or are we not the leading place? And this is again another area dispute. On the left, they say we are, but what I can tell from the evidence, what I can find that's been written in the documents I've looked at, what we did was the most in the late 1600s up to about 1745. And that's sugar and tobacco. But, oh, it didn't come out. I don't know why this didn't come out. These are the major ports in tobacco. This is Devon. We have less than 1% of the trade of tobacco in the country. It makes sense because we are poorer, smaller, and if you're going to import tobacco, you do London, Glasgow, Bristol, Liverpool, not small places like Plymouth. That hasn't yet reached people who will be angry at that. It's not enough. And the picture builds up that Devon wasn't as important as other places. But we've known Bristol, Liverpool, Glasgow, or Liverpool, London, Glasgow, Bristol are the leading ports. So everybody else is going to be in the second group. It makes sense. Now, emancipation in 1834, when all slaves were free, allows us to look at something with statistical certainty. Because in that year, slave owners were compensated for the loss of their slaves. They got a fixed amount, the slaves got nothing. And we have documents, tens of thousands of documents that catalog the entire empire. Now, this is a letter from a slave owner in Dawlish, working out how much money she's going to get. But this is what we have. We have names of slaves. We have their color, where they live, where they're born, and their ages, and their gender. Every slave owner in the West Indies across the empire was repeatedly surveyed so that we knew exactly how many they had, so that we could give them the exact amount of money. So we can say with certainty how many live in Devon against Cornwall, or Yorkshire, or London. So what I did was look at the 1st of August, 1834, when that Emancipation Act passed. Now, there's another way of looking at this. You know, how did we benefit? Well, anybody, there were nearly 13 million Brits in 1831. Anyone who had coffee or tea or cotton from a slave-producing colony, slave colony, benefited. But direct benefit of the owners, there were 34,000 slave owners across the empire. How many of them lived in Devon? This is my question. Going through 34,000 names, bound to have missed some. But out of 34,000 names, if you could come up with a figure in your head as to how many were in Devon, it's not going to be enough or it's going to be too much. What's the number? Well, on the 1st of August, 34. Now, if you have been saying there's none, or if you've been saying everybody was a slave owner, which you hear in lectures, 34 is challenging. It's inconvenient history. Now, as far as I'm concerned, if it was 33 or 35, I couldn't care less. It's what you have to work with. You don't do the evidence does you. It leads you in your own way. So, that wasn't enough for some. Almost the first lecture I gave, somebody stood up and said, oh, well, 1834 is a bad year. We all know Devon owned more in the 1700s. But the problem is there is not the evidence for it. Not only has nobody worked on it, but we don't have the documents. It could be that Devon had 10 times as many slave owners in the 18th century, but we just don't know. There's neither the evidence, nor is anybody trying to do the work. Oh, we do have this. So, the middle yellow figure, the figure here, we owned just under 5,000 human beings in Devon. There were absentee owners who lived here and their slaves were overseas. They received, in today's money, just under 10,000 million pounds, 10 million quid. 9,399,629 pounds. That is just under 1% of all the money given to all slave owners. It's a portion. Again, it's too much or it's too small. What's interesting is how many Devonians were compensated against how many gentry we figure. Now, these statistics can, you can do whatever you want with statistics, but what we can say is it wasn't everybody who owned slaves, it was a small number. Most of them had not purchased their slaves, but they inherited them from their families. This is the more interesting one, which relates to you. 6 were born in Devon, about 34. 1 more was born in London, but his family lived in Devon, so I think we could say 7 out of 34 are residents. Big question is, how Devonian really are they? Because we've got things going on with these documents. Now, those 34 are only on the 1st of August, 1834. The rest of the 1830s, we've got another 11 slave owners who live here. Then, afterwards, we have at least 75 more come to Devon, sometimes just for a few months, sometimes for decades. Sometimes they live here, other times it's long holidays. But there are 2 things that are interesting, or I find interesting. One, Plymouth, or particularly Devonport. We've got a handful of men in the Navy who are here for a short while as part of their naval career. They come and go. But more interesting to you are the dozens and dozens who take their slave compensation money from the West Indies and then retire to Devon. Where do they retire to? Well, Ilfracombe, Dolge, Tinder, Sydenham, Buckley, Exmouth, Torquay. Nobody goes to Cullompton. Nobody goes to Oakhampton or Prenton. They're going to nice places with other nice people who are doing nice things. They're not Devon born, they're a new Devonian. They're the start of a retired community which has benefited Devon now for 200 years and transforms Devon. Now, there may be people with second homes or third homes, and you can say to some of them, there's one man in Sydney who comes down for 2 or 3 weeks a year. is he really Devonian? Well, he's that other type of person. But others make their home here. And that's where it becomes interesting. So people like Elizabeth Barrett Brown, who comes to sit there for a few months and ends up spending 3 years here. She is the daughter of a slave owner who has compensation, and they associate with other West Indian retirees, like a little community of them. I've got a list of where they're born, and I've done all the statistics of how old they were when they got that grant, and how much money they got, how long they stayed in Devon. Let me tell you, if you're a statistician, it's really fascinating. But who are the famous ones? Who are the people of interest? Well, Annie Palmer. If you've read The White Witch of Rose Hall, it's a salacious novel in 1923 of a Devon woman who's a slave owner. She's famous for murdering her 3 husbands, for masochistic, debauched sex with her black slaves in the basement, for voodoo. It's got everything in it. Or, and that's her house in Jamaica, either that's her, or she's the little old lady who lived very quietly in Sydney for most of her life. The Jamaicans have one version, in Sydney we have another version. And what we have is a number of people pulled together for a novel. In Jamaica, they know Annie Palmer. She's famous. But in Devon, we've got other slave owners who should know better. Winslade House, a very smart restaurant in Cliff St. Mary. Well, 3 Devonians, including the man that owned there, had 51% of the Devon awards. The rest of the slave owners got much less. Now, who's he? He's Mr. Porter. His father comes from Demerara. They then buy Rock Bear Manor, and Mr. Porter buys Winslade House. His brother's at Rock Bear. In the end, his brother Thomas runs out of money. He spends everything he has, and he lives at the Dower House, Nutwell Lodge, high in Nutwell, just when we pass it all the time. Teshmaker, he's an Exmouth boy, as is his brother. Again, slave owners. They've lived in Tiverton, where they're waiting for their children to go through Blundell's. They've been in Bath, they've been in London, they've been in Ilfracombe, and they have a very luxurious lifestyle. But the one that's really interesting to you is Lord Roll. Of course, here at Bicton and Stevenston up north. Not the family today, and that the bloodline has changed, but it's got the same name. Now, Dennis Roll has an estate given to him in the 1760s in Florida. He builds up 50,000 acres. He's known for trying to give working class people a chance. So they're down on their luck, they may get arrested for a petty crime. He brings them to Florida, where they start a new colony. The people that make that colony pay are the 200 black slaves. Keep it going. Then in the 1780s, Florida is given to the Spanish. Roll loses his plantation, and he moves them all to a new plantation in Great Exuma in the Bahamas, which you can see on the left. And the Bahamas are here. Well, Dennis Roll, Dennis Roll is on the left. He's trying to set up utopia. It's called Xanadu by some. He dies in 1797, having tried to establish some sort of income in the Bahamas with his slaves. Cotton dies out. There is nothing that the slaves can produce to earn their keep. His son, the first Lord Roll, is stuck with 400 slaves who cost him an equivalent today of $70,000 a year. So from 1797 to 1834, Mr. Roll, Lord Roll, tries to get rid of his slaves. He tries to sell them, and he's not allowed. He tries to send them to a different island. The government says no. He tries to give them their freedom. The government says, if you do that, all slaves will want their freedom. But he says they're costing me a fortune. In 1834, when he gets his compensation awards, he makes them free. Now we've had a period, and this is a statue in the Bahamas to a man called Pompey, who led an insurrection just before. It was a little guerrilla war for about 5 years. Now, Roll hands over his estate. Not only does he make them free, he finally gives them all of his property, thousands of acres of land in the Bahamas, on which those people still live, and is held in common in 5 estates across the Bahamas, almost uniquely. This is either the son of a slave or a grandson of a slave in the early 1900s. What's interesting is they regard Roll as a benevolent owner. He's talked about as a hero in the Bahamas. This is a letter which was written into an Exeter newspaper when they went free. From the slaves. Now, all you have to do is read 2 sentences and you realize it was never written by a group of illiterate slaves. It was written probably by the lawyer in the Bahamas, expressing what the Rolls wanted people to hear. Roll was never for the end of slavery, only for the end of the financial loss. But what he did was rather extraordinary. Oops. And that man there is called Roll. Because when they were made free, they all took on a name. And it was all Roll. The Rolls here die out. So there are no longer descendants of the white Rolls, but there are tens of thousands of black Rolls all across the West Indies now, who didn't have any genetic input from the Rolls, but they just took on the name as a sign of tribute. It's an extraordinary history. Now, and it makes you think. This is the man that is another twist. This is Rackenford Manor up in North Devon, and this man, Mr. Daniel, called the King of Bristol, bought that estate. He had nearly 10 million in compensation money in today's money. This was his 3rd house. And it shows the extent of Bristol coming down into Devon with its slavery. It's on a scale of nothing in Devon matched. So we look at our history regarding slavery, and there are things we can talk about, elements. The woman on the left, she was a Fulford, then her mother was a Fulford, she married people in East Devon, but she's Colleton. She's John Colleton's wife. And she lost her estate based in Exmouth in the Carolinas. She writes about it. She never talks about owning slaves, they're only attendants. The image on the right, which has come up badly, is the image of the brook. It showed how many slaves were forced in, squeezed into a slave voyage. It's one of the great images of abolition. It comes from Devon. The image on the bottom, I put in because the biggest colony for Devon isn't the West Indies, it's Newfoundland. That's where we make most of our money. But by saying that, you're denying the role of the West Indies, but you're not. That's historical evidence, that's the fact. But it's not convenient to say that. And this is the big thing. What is more important? What people want to believe or what the evidence tells us? And I've been accused of saying the wrong thing because it doesn't help somebody's campaign, because it doesn't help our view of the world. We look at this image of Soviet Union and how it's come back fairly recently in the last few months. And I was sent to Russia after the Soviet Union fell, with a whole party of academics from Exeter to teach Russian historians how to write history without censorship. Shortly after that, Mr. Putin came along. Those archives were shut down in Russia. Censorship came back. Historians have been assassinated. Historians are now in prison for writing the wrong kind of history. And what's happening now is historians are afraid to say what the documents tell us. So they don't say anything at all. The right and the left in America got so contemptuous of each other in this respect and others that they stopped talking to each other. And what happened? Well, this happened, which has been the most corrosive element of not telling the truth, of, false news, false history, of history being what one wants it to be. And what he's done is he's allowed Confederate flags and Nazi flags to be shown again in public across America. We now have in America groups calling for the extermination of the Jews again. We thought that was behind us. And why? Why? Because people are afraid to talk about the evidence and allow the worst of human nature to come by and come through. There are things in Devon which are hidden. These two women were famous in Devon, the Elkington ponies. They walked in unison. They were twin sisters. They looked alike. They walked alike. They were sight and Torquay in Exeter. What we didn't know was they were mixed race. That may have been why they were separate. You can buy prints, you can buy porcelain. But Victorian society didn't know their mother was a slave. Their father was an MP. And the reason why this is important, it's not just because of the legacy of how we view Black people today. It's because modern slavery is around us all over this country. And we need to understand the past in order to counter the thousands and thousands of people in slavery all across England who are working in fields, or nail bars, in brothels, women who are drugged to their ears with awful things so that they're compliant as prostitutes. Now, how did they live with it in the past? How did we live with slavery today? Well, modern slavery and that history helps inform one to the other. I want to end, though, with Moses Smith. I think he's the last Devon slave. He comes to Barnstable in the late 1800s. He's a fish seller. His wife is a fish hawker as well, fish wife. And the two of them drink and brawl in public, not with each other, but with other people. Mr. Smith finally brings somebody to court for beating him up. And he's upset for being called a black dog and a black monkey. His wife tells the judge, I didn't marry a black dog, I married a man. And Moses Smith says to the judge, I've had this for 30 years since I've come to Devon. I've been called Negro, I've been called nigger, and I'm just tired of it and I want it to stop. And the most compelling line he says, I can't help the color of my skin. It could be today. Born a slave and he comes to Devon, it's human nature. It's what we've had. There is no point condemning the past. I think we try to understand it. We try to understand it not just for the people who are still discriminated against, but for all those people who are helping England's economy now grow in ways we don't think about, like they didn't think about then, in terrible conditions of slavery. It's life. What I think is most important of all is all history is important, but only accurate history counts. Thank you very much.
Absolutely superb presentation, Todd. Thank you so much. prepared to go through all those thousands of documents, looking at all the artifacts, to find that all-important evidence. When our son was at school in Kettering, they had a project where they had to go into Kettering, the high street, and ask people what they thought about the shops in Kettering. And he said, of course, the temptation was to just come home and back to school with the sheet and make up what everybody said. And Todd hasn't taken that temptation, but unfortunately, as we know, that some of our politicians don't present us with all the facts and all the evidence. It's very, very tempting to make things up. And what Todd has done is really impressive because he's brave, he's prepared to take on that challenge. And I think in this world where so much is on the internet, it's really important that we have historians like Todd prepared to put in all those hours of research and not to make it up. So thank you, Todd. Thank you. So that we can have the pleasure of reading his book. So once again, Todd, thank you.